Just watched an interview with Tony Blair on Good Morning Britain from a few days ago. Um, Alistair Campbell has taken over from Piers Morgan in that slot. That's an interesting choice. Of course, Campbell has a long media experience, long journalistic career, and will forever be associated with New Labour. So there will probably be a few eyebrows raised with Alistair Campbell interviewing his former boss. And that's it. Susanna Reid threw in a little feminist bit of tokenism by saying that there was a trivial thing about Tony Blair's hair recently because he looked a bit like Bob Geldof. He had long hair, and she said, "Oh, now you can see from the other point of view where women are constantly focused on for the look." Yeah, I thought she was exaggerating that a little bit. That does happen, but I think she was drawing it out a little bit um, from what was a trivial moment. But anyway, before I get into the main point of this video, just a word about Tony Blair. I think he will always be a polarizing figure. For some people, the very mention of Tony Blair will attract sneers, you know. Um, he is someone who will always be controversial. Um, for the left, he will always be seen as bringing his party too far to the right and selling out. And for the right, he will be associated with the rise of Big Brother state, as they see it, sort of in that sense. And there's other criticisms as well. Iraq was polarizing, particularly for the left, but to an extent with the right as well. Um, but Blair made some interesting points in this interview, and I was actually going to talk about an article in the Times from a few days ago, but I'll just mention a few things he said in this interview, which I thought was significant. On the subject of Iraq, Blair pointed out that his four successors as Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, David Cameron, Theresa May, and Boris Johnson, all supported the Iraq War. So if there was a backlash against that, then it certainly isn't manifested at electoral level. Indeed, Blair won a third term in 2005 after the Iraq controversy. So I think there was deep controversy, there was public anger, but not so much so that it cost him a third electoral victory. In fact, I recall the 2005 election being quite mundane. The issues were not trivial, but they weren't. Iraq was not a major issue in that campaign, despite that being the first general election after the Iraq War. So that was curious. But that's an interesting point that Blair mentioned, and I hadn't thought about that before, but it's true. His four successors all supported the Iraq War. The other point he made was, in his view, he had a lot of sympathy with Keir Starmer because he is probably facing the most difficult takeover in Labour political history. Um, but he also said that the appeal with people like Boris Johnson and Donald Trump is they are characters. You know what you get with them. And that's how Blair explains the popularity of Trump and Johnson, at least within their base. Um, I mean, it's a curious thing with these recent election results that we've had that an opposition party loses a by election. That's an unusual situation, and it's definitely a bad sign for Keir Starmer. Um, the thing is, no matter what Boris Johnson does, no matter what controversy there is, his personal popularity seems to remain relatively high. The left just don't seem to be doing major damage to Johnson. He remains relatively popular. And is that a character thing? Is it, I mean, look at the controversies that Johnson's had. His handling of the Dominic Cummings saga, his, recent Tory sleaze allegations, the renovation of Downing Street and the money spent on that. These are all things that would probably topple another prime minister. For some reason, Johnson just seems to survive. Um, and that maybe indicates more about the state that Labour is in rather than necessarily the Tories being very strong. But I do think that Labour needs to understand that playing class war and portraying the Tories as, you know, the old Tories is a mistake because the Conservative Party has modernised. Under David Cameron, they've done that. And so playing the old class battles, I don't think will work with Labour. I think Labour faces a major problem. For one reason, and this is just my opinion, it's a very big party. It's got the largest political party membership, I think, in Europe. So within that, you're going to get different camps. David Aronovich, also in the Times, pointed out that, in his view, it's not a stark choice between Labour appealing to metropolitan woke young people, predominantly young, versus traditional red wall Labour voters. He said it's more complex than that. At least that's what he's alluding to. Um, I think there's a number of things that Labour faces. Um, Tony Blair made an interesting point on this regarding leadership. He said that Keir Starmer is sensible but not radical enough. Jeremy Corbyn was radical but not sensible in terms of policies. And I think that's a fairly good way to sum it up. The problem with Keir Starmer is he's not particularly inspiring. I think he's capable. I think he's smart. Um, but he does sometimes come across more like a lawyer than the leader of a major party aspiring to be Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And I don't think being dull is the worst vice in politics by any means. The problem is when your opponent is a character like Boris Johnson, that can be a flaw. Um, I personally have some contentions with Keir Starmer. I do not like the fact that he was largely silent about the Batley School protest. Now, people might say that was a localized incident. I disagree. It's now went to another school in Sheffield. A similar incident happened. I don't think that's just a local story. I think that has implications on society. You know, if you have a mob of Islamists basically putting threats on a teacher's life because he has delivered a lesson deemed to be blasphemous in the United Kingdom, I do think that has implications in wider society, and I think it's a responsibility for a leading politician to take a position on that. Starmer was silent. Now, he might have addressed it subsequently, but at the time when it mattered, he was silent. Um, and that does not go down well with me. I also think he's too keen to appeal to the woke faction of his party, a little bit like Joe Biden. I think both Biden and Starmer are relatively centrist figures, probably centre left, but centrist nonetheless. But they both appeal to the woke factions of the party. In the case of Starmer, an example of this would be that ridiculous stunt where he took the knee. It was pure gesturing, and I really, it's the sort of thing that just the average Labour voter is not interested in. And I'm not sure why he done it, whether he thought that he personally just felt it was the right thing to do, or he was virtue signaling. I don't know what it was, but I think it was a mistake. Um, so Blair actually made an interesting point about wokeism, and this might get a few people by surprise because New Labour was associated very much with political correctness and to an extent identity politics. But I think it goes well beyond anything New Labour proposed or that the associations right or wrong with New Labour because this wokeism is not it's far left. It's far left ideology, and I think Tony Blair is right to say that. Well, this is I'm quoting here from the Times. Blair said the party needed to develop a compelling answer to the problems of the day and use that to search for a new governing coalition that could build outward from the centre ground. Present Labour expresses perfectly the progressive dilemma. Corbyn was radical but not sensible. Keir seemed sensible but not radical, he wrote. He warned that while right wing parties had adapted and adjusted by developing a new economic and cultural message, the left was pushing tax and spend and a new fashioned social cultural message around extreme identity and anti police politics, which for large swathes of people is voter repellent. Defund the police may be the less most damaging political slogan since the dictatorship of the proletariat, he wrote. To top it off, the right inventors pride in their nation, while parts of the left seem embarrassed by the very notion. Well, that's true. I mean, the whole fiasco over the Union flag being in Labour Party headquarters, and you know the fact that Starmer had to seek out committees and that. Blair said that as a result, Labour was being backed into an electorally off-putting positions on culture, gender, race, and identity. A progressive party seeking power, which looks askance at the likes of Trevor Phillips, Sarah Khan, or J.K. Rowling, is not going to win. Progressive politics needs to debate these cultural questions urgently and openly, he argued. Um, yeah, and I won't read out the whole article, but I think Blair touches on a lot of good points. And, you know, for those who sneer, there is no getting away from the fact that this is a man who is the last Labour leader to win an election in what, 16 years now? 16 years since the Labour Party won a general election. That's that really is a sobering fact. And so people can sneer at Blair. They could say he was too right wing. They can call him a liar. They can call him a war criminal. But from a political point of view, I think he is someone worth listening to. I really do. And that doesn't mean I'm sycophantic to Blair. I certainly don't agree with everything he done. There's aspects of New Labour I didn't like. Um, quite a few of them. There were certain Big Brother pushes that I think definitely were would have been a big mistake. I think you know, the plan to adopt the euro would have been a mistake. I think that the Iraq War was a disaster. You know, it wasn't. There was no proper planning for a post-war Iraq. There's a lot of areas I can think that Blair deserves criticism on, but I don't mind saying that personally, I think he's the best prime minister of my lifetime. Um, and I think that there's an interesting point that Blair made about Labour winning that they would need to join forces with the Liberal Democrats. Well, that's interesting. There was, of course, that brief experiment with the various independents who tried to form the Change UK party, and it kind of fell flat because it seemed to be a contradiction in terms because the name was Change UK, but they weren't really proposing a change. They wanted a second EU referendum to keep the status quo. I think the problem with that was I was interested in it because it was a centrist movement, but I think it fell flat from poor organisation, from mixed messages, and it was just poorly named. It shouldn't have been called Change UK. I do think that there might be a compelling case for Starmer's Labour to join forces with the Liberal Democrats. The problem is that the the technical side of that is difficult because the Lib Dems are going to be reluctant to get into coalition again after their experience with the Tories. But they're a greatly reduced party, and that's something they need to consider. For Keir Starmer, some believe that he needs to be very radical and just expel all hard left factions. That would be a very radical and brave move. It's something, of course, Neil Kinnock done with the militant tendency in the 80s. I think it might be a sensible step. I mean, there's things I wouldn't totally dismiss Starmer because when he got into office as leader, that is, the Tories tried to portray him as a Remain lawyer. Well, it didn't really work because in Prime Minister's questions, Starmer never mentioned a second referendum. He didn't fall into that trap of being portrayed by the Tories as a liberal elite lawyer. It didn't work. Um, but, you know, Starmer, another advantage he has is he will never be Jeremy Corbyn. He will never be associated with a far left worldview. And you know, Corbynites are blind to this. They will deny it. But Jeremy Corbyn's worldview was absolutely far left. I mean, this is a man who praised Maduro in Venezuela. This is a man who called the IRA and Hezbollah friends. It's just, I honestly believe Corbyn's worldview was profoundly dangerous. It was anti-West. It was a false narrative, and it was absolutely unelectable in this country. Corbynites are blind to that. I honestly think they're more interested in their agenda and platform than actually getting into power. Because if they were realistic about power, they would accept that the wider public is not interested in the sort of things that they're pushing. They just aren't. The wider British public does not want a Venezuela model. It doesn't. Or at least it doesn't want a prime minister who admires a Venezuelan autocrat. I mean, I remember Corbyn's stance on Russia, which I thought was outrageous. After the Salisbury attack, he was actually basically being neutral and said, "Well, we need to hear the Russian point of view," and basically using the same language as Russia Today, indeed a network that he regularly appeared on. Anyway, Corbyn's gone, and I think it is true to say that you can't just blame Corbyn for all of Labour's problems. I think Corbyn and Corbynism explains a lot of it, but I don't think it's the only issue. I do think that voters aren't overly enthusiastic by Starmer. Um, so what does Labour need? I think someone like Starmer would be a good leader if he was more, if he came across as more ambitious or at least more outspoken, frankly. Um, like I say, dullness is not the worst vice in politics, but the problem is, no matter what Starmer announces or does, it's going to get overshadowed by Boris Johnson because Johnson's such a big character. Starmer maybe does need to be a bit more radical, a bit more headline grabbing. That doesn't mean being sensationalist, but unfortunately, that's politics. The public react to that, and I think Keir Starmer needs to understand this. But I also think he needs to be. I think he's too hesitant on important issues, and I don't want calling someone a card is a loaded accusation, but I am not happy about the fact he was silent on the Batley school protest. I do think Tony Blair would have said something had he been Labour leader. I do think that's an issue or an example of an issue that you cannot be neutral on. You cannot be silent on as a leader of a major party. Starmer should have come out and said it's absolutely unacceptable that a teacher in a British school is getting death threats. We do not have blasphemy laws in this country. Instead, it was silence. And I think that's absolutely unacceptable. So, yeah, I think Blair makes a lot of good points. A formal coalition with the Liberal Democrats, I can't see it happening just yet. Probably further down the line because, in a sense, Starmer needs to sort out his own party first before any notion of that. The next general election will probably be 2024, 2025. So, anything can happen in 3 years. I think a lot of Johnson's premiership will be judged on coronavirus. That's the big hallmark issue of his premiership, more so even than Brexit. Um, so I think what one position that Starmer's taken, and I actually agree with, is the call for an independent inquiry into COVID. You know, Tories say, oh, that's just going to be finger pointing, but not if it was independent. I mean, 127,000 deaths, extreme disruption to public life, um, major economic blows. These are all really, really vital issues that have affected the country. I think it's absolutely appropriate to have an independent inquiry. Why? Because we need to know what we've done right and wrong if this happens again. I really think that you cannot have a situation as profound as this, 127,000 dead. You cannot have uh, an event that big and just say, okay, let's move on. There has to be some sort of learning from this. There has to be some sort of there has to be something taken from it. So an example of an ambitious project that Starmer could head is a 1945 moment that Labour's spoken about. The problem is I think he just needs to be more outspoken. I don't mean turn populist necessarily. I don't mean get cheap attack sound bites or anything like that. But I think he does somehow need to find a more outspoken voice in certain areas. Because right now, I think Starmer is, he is getting overshadowed. Considering he's leader of the opposition, he's really not making that much of an impact. and that doesn't bode well for Labour. So that's my thoughts. But I think, by the way, thought from another Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, the former Labour Prime Minister, said that Starmer has got to be given time to fight the next election. He told Times Radio, I hope and I expect that over the summer he'll be spending his time going to all the different communities of this country, spending time not just giving speeches but listening and learning. That's easier said than done. Uh, a visit to Hartlepool, maybe, could be practical. I mean, obviously, Labour isn't going to re-win Hartlepool until the next general election, if at all. But at least going and learning would be something. Um, I mean, my local Labour council candidate got defeated by the Liberal Democrat, and he wasn't a bad councillor. In fact, he defeated me when I ran for council in 2008. He was an okay councillor. I wouldn't say he was a particularly bad councillor, but it indicates a trend. And the Liberal Democrat candidate was really energetic in this campaign. I got something like six different leaflets from him, one glossy leaflet from the Labour candidate. So um, I voted for the Liberal Democrat purely in terms of hard work, but I didn't vote against the Labour candidate because I don't think he's a particularly bad councillor. It's just that that's an indication of the national trend. You know, a city like Sunderland, which is pretty Labour, Labour lost five councillors in these local elections. They still have control of the council, but it's just an indication of where things are heading. Anyway, that's just some of my thoughts. I think a healthy democracy needs a strong opposition, and we have to have a vision that we're not going to have the Tories in power forever. It's not that I disagree with everything the Tories have done, but I am naturally a man of the centre. So the Tories are not my natural party, even though some of my positions are quite conservative, especially on crime. But Tony Blair is someone I do listen to, and people might scorn at that, they might disagree. He won three general elections, and I think his opinions carry some weight. Let me know your thoughts. Thanks for watching.